Hi everybody, and welcome back to the second video of June. Now, if you tuned in to our video last week on natural selection, you know that this month we are focusing on methods of selection in the natural world. So last week we talked about natural selection. This week we're going to be talking about sexual selection, and then next week is going to be kin selection. Now, for those of you who have not watched any of our videos yet, maybe this is your first one, I am Educator Emily, and I'm going to be leading you through like an introductory base level lesson on sexual selection, and this is responsible for some of the weirdest and wildest behavioral and physical traits that we see throughout the natural world. Now, like the natural selection video and the kin selection video that will follow, and before I start, I just want to say that these videos, the sexual selection, natural selection, and kin selection, are all introductory courses kind of into this material. They are not all encompassing informational modules. There is a lot more that I'm not covering in these videos, and if you guys are really interested in reading more about these modes of selection, the resources out there for you are endless. But these videos can serve as a great introduction to that topic. As always, we're going to start off with a couple of definitions, and in order to talk about sexual selection, we have to define it. So what is it? Sexual selection is selection arising through preferences of one sex for certain characteristics in the other sex. And when this happens, this doesn't mean that sexual selection is the only evolutionary pressure that this species is under. Natural selection and sexual selection can work on the same traits. They just happen to work differently. So sexual selection aims to maximize reproductive success on behalf of the male or the female, focused mainly around mating, whereas natural selection works on overall survival. Now, there are two parts of sexual selection. There is female choice, where females of a species actively pick males to mate with, and there is male competition. This is the second part of sexual selection, and this is males fighting other males for access to females. So think the rut in Elk, or male lions fighting each other to take over a pride. That's male competition. Another word that we're going to define for this video is the word gamete, which might come up later on in discussions. And a gamete is a mature haploid male or female germ cell. So essentially a gamete is an egg if you're a female, and sperm if you are a male. So why does sexual selection occur? Now, there are multiple hypotheses for why this is, and so we're gonna explore some of these hypotheses and principles, and then we're going to talk about some real-life examples of sexual selection in the wild. So one of these principles for why sexual selection occurs is known as Batemans Principle. And the core of this principle essentially breaks down to males and females achieve reproductive success differently. Males are limited by the amount of other males in a population. However, females are limited by the amount of gametes that they have. Because of this, males are going to have a higher variance in mating success, and sexual selection is going to act on the sex with higher variance, which is males. In addition, females produce large, immobile, fixed amount of gametes. Often in many species, the amount of eggs a female is born with are the only amounts of gametes that she's going to have for her entire life. Whereas males continue throughout their life to produce small, energetically inexpensive, mobile gametes. And this is Bateman's principle in a whole. Basically, males and females achieve reproductive success differently, and because of this, you're going to have a selection mechanism acting on it. There's also differential parental care. This difference in parental care can also be a driver for sexual selection, as females provide more care for their offspring in species where females provide the care. Sexual selection on males will intensify, and this feeds off of each other, so you have increased parental care over here and increased sexual selection over here, and these two work together to create a positive feedback loop where each amplification of each end of the circle makes the other stronger. So more parental care, more sexual selection, more sexual selection, more parental care, creating a sort of positive feedback loop, which is also known as a Fisherian runaway, and we'll talk about this a little bit later with peacocks. Because of this, because females are the ones investing the parental care into their offspring, they are going to be picky. So they're going to want to mate with a male who will give their offspring good genes and kind of make their parenting efforts worth it. So why are females picky? Yes, they want to make their parenting efforts worth it, but what are some hypotheses that discuss this or talk about this? So there are two that really discuss this, that are talked about in the sexual selection scientific realm, and they are the sexy sons hypothesis and the good genes hypothesis. So let's talk about the sexy son hypothesis first. And basically, this is exactly what you think it is. Females are selecting for traits that are aesthetically pleasing. And by doing this, they get attractive sons that will potentially be selected by females in future generations, assuming, of course, that that trait is still deemed desirable or attractive or a signifier of a good mate. This hypothesis kind of rests on the fact that these traits are arbitrary and that there's no signifier that this trait is saying, you know, hey, I have good genes or I am strong. In this hypothesis, females are selecting for attractiveness alone. It's not like attractiveness is a mask for some other genetically positive trait or physically positive trait or anything. It's just because, hey, that bird looks good, I want my kids to look like that bird. That might maximize their mating success. Now, of course, you know, we don't know if birds are out there thinking this. Of course, when I speak, I am anthropomorphizing many of the species here, so just keep that in mind. I find it makes it a little easier to understand. So in the sexy sons hypothesis, basically females are selecting for an arbitrary, attractive trait, something that they see as visually aesthetically pleasing. And in doing so, they will get attractive sons that will then hopefully be picked by females in the next generation. And thus the genes will carry on that way. Like natural selection, sexual selection is all about increasing your genetic success. Now there's also the good genes hypothesis. So in the sexy sons hypothesis, females were selecting for attractive traits because they just found them attractive. The good genes hypothesis theorizes that these attractive traits signify some sort of good genetic quality. The more elaborate the trait, the better the genetic quality, and thus females will select for males with more elaborate traits or higher genetic quality. And so you will see females wanting to mate with males with longer tails if you're a bird, or larger racks if you are a deer or an elk. Or maybe you have a more elaborate mating display if you're a bird of paradise. And these traits signify something about your genetic makeup. And the better you are at the dance, the bigger rack you have, the better your genes are. This is an honest signal. And because of female selection on these traits, it creates male competition, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. This is known as intersexual selection, where one sex is selecting or pushing another sex. Intrasexual selection would be, for example, male against male. If you are a bison male fighting another bison for rights to a female, that is intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is a female picking from an array of males to mate with. So now that we've talked about the sexy sons hypothesis, the good genes hypothesis, Batemans Principle, things like that, let's talk about some real life examples of sexual selection in the wild and what the costs and benefits to having these sexually selected traits are for the males that have them. Now, because of sexual selection, we often tend to see in species where this is happening, sexual dimorphism, which is where males and females look different. One of the best examples of this is in peafowl, commonly called peacocks. However, peacock just refers to the male, peahen refers to the female, peafowl refers to them both. So here are some costs and benefits to these elaborate peacock feathers that we see in male peafowl. Now, this is a physical trait that has been sexually selected through multiple generations over a long period of time. And these tails, while they're gorgeous, there are costs to having these. So the growth of these feathers is extremely energetically expensive, and this isn't often something that we think about with like traits on ourselves. We don't necessarily think of the energy it takes to, you know, grow your hair or to grow another inch. But these trains of feathers are extremely long, and the longer the train, it means the more nutrients that peacock has ingested are going to the creation of that train as opposed to other maybe more biologically pertinent functions. The length of these trains also makes it extremely difficult for male peafowl to fly. It creates a lot of drag, they're heavy, and because of this, sometimes male peafowl are vulnerable to predators, right? If they can't fly away from the tiger in the forest that's trying to eat them, then that tiger is probably going to have an easy meal. In addition, the bright green, the bright blue, these are very conspicuous colors in a forest where most of the color palette are neutral browns and greens and oranges. Bright blue and bright green, especially iridescent blue and green, are going to stand out, and this makes the peacock itself vulnerable to just being spotted by predators. However, female peafowl, the peahens, they love these elaborate traits. The better and bigger the tail that a peacock has, if he's an adult, has signified that, despite having this physical handicap, this long tail that, might make me more conspicuous to predators, make it more difficult to fly, and is energetically expensive, I have good enough genes to show you that I have survived all of that. I am stronger than all of that. And female peafowl love this. And thus, males that have longer, brighter, more elaborate trains are going to be mated with more, and their genes are going to become more prevalent in the population. And this is why we see these elaborate peafowl or peacock feather trains in the males. Now, birds in general are excellent examples of sexual selection, so we're going to talk about a second one, and this one is the satin bowerbird, which is so cool. Bowerbirds are amazing. Their way of finding a mate is behavioral as opposed to physical. So satin bowerbirds, the way that they attract females is they create these bowers, and they will bring various gifts or things to these bowers to entice females. And often these objects tend to be of a specific color. So you will find males, only bringing red objects to a bower, or blue, or purple. They tend to have a theme, and they can range from anywhere from flowers to plastic bottle caps. And the male will arrange all of these objects around his bower in a very meticulous manner. And this is very energetically expensive, because not only does he have to leave his bower and potentially now make it vulnerable to other males who might destroy it, and thus he might have to start all over again, but he has to find these objects, bring them back to his bower, and then once he has all the objects, he has to rearrange them. So this takes a lot of time away from, time that could be spent foraging, or drinking water, or defending territory, other things that are very biologically pertinent. However, much like female peafowl love the elaborate traits of male peacock feathers, female bowerbirds love elaborate, intense bowers. And the more conspicuous, the cleaner, the fancier, the neater, the more pristine the bower is, the higher likelihood that that male bowerbird is going to have of mating with that female. So this is a very energetically expensive behavior on behalf of the male to gather all of these objects, bring them to the bower, and organize them as such. However, in the end, it's genetically worth it, because he's going to have more females that will mate with him. Now, a more common example that's a little bit closer to home that we might be able to relate with a little bit more easily are the racks that we see on moose and deer, elk, horns on bison, that sort of physical trait. Now, these are both physical and behavioral traits. So this is kind of a combination of the two. Now, here in this example, we are talking about elk, but many of these same things that we're going to be discussing with elk apply to other horned or antlered males in species where these traits have evolved. So for antlers, these grow back every year. Horns stay on throughout the period of that animal's life, so they're not as energetically expensive, but antlers are extremely energetically expensive. They grow back every year, and the bigger the rack, right, it's the more nutrients that are being diverged away from other parts of that animal to growing this rack of antlers. These can also be detrimental to survival. So in these species, moose, elk, pronghorn, sheep, etc., males often engage in male-male combat for access to a harem of females. And when this happens, often the tines of these antlers or horns, they can get interlocked with the other male in which they are fighting with. This can often lead to two males becoming locked together until death, and they will starve and never actually get the right to mate. Antlers can also get so big and so complicated that when elk or moose or any of these other animals are walking through the underbrush, their antlers can actually get stuck and entangled in shrubbery and trees, and they may starve to death that way. And for a very long time, it was actually thought that this was how the Irish elk went extinct. Now there's more research showing that that was not necessarily the case, but basically these Irish elk had some of the largest antlers that the world had ever seen on any animal, and it was actually thought that sexual selection had driven them to extinction by selecting for these massively large antlers. So not only do these antlers, the bigger the better, the more elaborate, serve as a physical trait to the female that, hey, you have the genetics and the ability to survive and allocate the nutrients towards this very elaborate trait while still staying alive and still staying fit, they also can be used behaviorally. So often these males will fight with other males for access to a harem of females. The bigger the rack, the bigger the antlers, the better chances you are going to have of winning against another male and winning a harem of females that will then mate with you. All in all, I think you've noticed a trend in these three examples that while these traits can be extremely costly for multiple reasons, they all have the benefit of higher mating success, and that is enough to drive the evolution of these costly traits. So now that we've discussed some examples of these exaggerated traits, how do they evolve in the first place? What makes females select for these traits in males? One of the hypotheses for this is the sensory bias hypothesis. This hypothesis states that female preference for a trait that we see in a male as a result of sexual selection arises as a byproduct for a sensory perception of something else. For example, females may be more sensitive to sound frequencies, color frequencies, patterns, etc., because it helps them to survive in their environments and thus help them to raise offspring to adulthood more successfully, or even just keep themselves alive. And this states that females are thus predisposed to like certain traits, and these traits will tend to fit this current sensory bias very well. They will be conspicuous or easy to notice and see or hear, and they will be closely matched, or they will be very honest traits. So, having, for example, an honest trait is having a big rack of antlers and being genetically fit. These two things go hand in hand together. The large antlers signify genetic fitness. They are an honest trait. And this hypothesis, the sensory bias hypothesis, basically predicts that female preference for a trait evolves before the trait itself evolves in males. And male signals will evolve to match this female preference or female bias for some sort of sensory signal. So, for example, let's say that you're a bird, and let's say that you are a female bird and you're especially tuned in to the color red. Females of your species are very sensitive to the color red because one of your main food sources are these nutritionally rich red berries. You love to eat these red berries because not only do they ensure that you have enough nutrients to survive, but you eat them all the time during the breeding season, so that way you have enough nutrients to give your chicks and ensure that your chicks survive as well. This is going to predispose you as a bird to be more sensitive to the color red because it helps you survive. Thus, if you see a male with red coloring in his feathers, maybe he has red spots all over his feathers or a bright red chest, you might be predisposed to like that male because of this sensory bias you have for red coloring. Thus, you might be more likely to mate with that male. Or maybe the males are gathering red objects like bowerbirds bringing red flowers or even red berries to their mating grounds. And over time, because other females of your species are also predisposed to see the color red, you will start to see a trait in males maybe to have these red flecks on their feathers or these red chests because they are the ones being selected by the females, thus they're the ones being mated with, and thus it is their traits that are getting passed to the next generation of males. So that's kind of an example of how the sensory bias hypothesis could play out in real life. Now, exaggerated traits could also evolve just because they're new. They're novel, they're exciting, they're something different from the norm. New is different, new is eye-catching. Why not try it and see what happens? Now, granted, this is not as elaborate as the sensory bias hypothesis, but it is something that scientists do seriously consider when they are studying this phenomenon in the wild. Earlier, I said that natural selection and sexual selection can work together on one trait. But when does natural selection take over? When does sexual selection potentially become too much? Like how people thought it was why the Irish elk went extinct, or is it going to potentially drive male peacocks to extinction? Well, natural selection takes over when the costs of having the sexually selected trait outweigh the benefits of having that trait. So basically, when the costs of the trait being energetically expensive, conspicuous, outweigh increased opportunities for mating. So, using the peacock example for this Fisherian runaway, basically, if male peacock feathers ever got too long in the population to the point where males were constantly being preyed upon because they couldn't fly away or because they were being so easily noticed, the trait no longer signifies to females, hey, I'm fit and I can survive. In fact, The trait now signifies, hey, I'm really easy to get preyed upon. And females aren't going to want their offspring to be preyed upon, right? Because they're going to want their genes to successfully be passed into the next generation and onward. And thus, these long male peacock feathers now become a dishonest trait. They no longer signify genetic fitness. Thus, females get no benefits from mating with males with long, elaborate trains. And males with these trains now have higher survival costs. And thus, this is when natural selection would step in, and kind of halt the process of sexual selection, and no longer would we see longer, elaborate trains being selected for in the population. You'd see train size decrease, you might even see the colors become duller, because females were no longer selecting for this trait. Now, I realize this is an incredibly complicated topic, but it is a super, super cool topic, and there are a bunch of other resources out there for you to explore if this is something that really gets your brain excited. This is a very cool phenomenon, and there's research happening all over the globe on sexual selection in birds, in baboons, in humans even, in fish. It's amazing, and it happens all over the globe. But to recap this short introduction to the topic, sexual selection is selection arising through preference in one sex for characteristics in the other sex. So females often selecting a trait that they find desirable in males. This occurs because males and females achieve reproductive success differently, and this is Batemans Principle. And often, because of this, females tend to be the quote-unquote choosier sex. By being choosy with males, they ensure that their offspring have good genetic quality that will ensure their survival in the future. And as a result of this choosiness in females, males in many species have evolved elaborate physical and behavioral traits, or both, that allow them to compete with males for access to females. Now, these elaborate traits are not costless. They often have many costs associated with them, and natural selection will take over when these costs begin to outweigh the benefits of higher mating success. And that's it. That is sexual selection recapped in a nutshell. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys learned something. Stay tuned next week for our video on kin selection, and then that will wrap up our 3 videos on the various forms of selection in the natural world. Again, I am Educator Emily, and thank you for tuning into this video. Make sure to follow ZooMontana on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are just ZooMontana, and that way you won't miss out on any of our engaging, awesome, and fun educational content. I will see you next week. Bye, everybody.